Welcome to Wadsworth History on Film, a program presented by the Wadsworth Area Historical Society and designed to record the oral history of Wadsworth for posterity. I'm Cesar Carino, your host. Our guest today is Orpha Hunsberger, a legend in her own time. Orpha, we're delighted that you're here today to be with us.
Thank you.
I can remember, as far back as I can remember, knowing who Orpha Hunsberger was. Of course, you didn't know me because I was a little kid. But my older brothers had your good husband, Willard Hunsberger, as a teacher. And as a result of that, when I was a little boy, they would come home and talk about Mr. Hunsberger and Mrs. Hunsberger.
Oh.
And then after I got a little older, I realized fully well that you actually were Mrs. Wadsworth, as it were.
Oh, no.
And I wanted to be sure that Wadsworth had your history recorded for posterity. You haven't always been a, shall we say, a senior citizen. When you were growing up, could you tell us a little bit about yourself, maybe where you were born and what you did when you were here in Wadsworth and which stores you went to and what the streets were like and all of those kinds of things? Tell us, just open up, Orpha, and tell us all about it.
Well, I was born in Cleveland.
In Cleveland.
And I went to a big city high school, Glenville High School.
Glenville High School.
Mm-hmm. And I met Willard in graduate school at the University of Wisconsin, where he was studying for his MA in history.
When was that, Orpha?
Pardon?
What year would that have been?
That would have been about 33.
1933.
1933.
Wow.
So I've been in Wadsworth a long time.
Oh, yes.
And we were married in early September of 36.
1936.
Yes, and I came to Wadsworth expecting, to be a free young married woman. And the day before school started, the home economics teacher resigned.
Who was that? Who would that have been at that time?
Well, I really don't know the name of the person, except that they were short, of a teacher, and school was beginning. And I had taught the year before. I had taught in Connecticut, and then I had taught in Cleveland.
And what did you teach in Connecticut and Cleveland?
Well, I was a major in biology.
Biology
I
major.
was a minor in home economics.
I see.
And what they needed down here was a home economics teacher. So Mr. Patterson, who was the principal at that time, called me. He was assistant principal, I believe. He called me and asked me if I would teach. So I did. The first semester, and I found myself on weekends so busy. One of the things that kept me so busy was ironing Willard shirts.
Oh, my.
Which were, at that time they were not
They were cotton.
Easy materials. They had to be ironed. And I decided that at mid-years that I guessed I would retire and they could find somebody else. Well, Carl Harder happened to hear that I was going to retire or stop, and he had a very good friend, Willeen, who later became his wife, from Georgia, that he wanted to see if she could come up to be here for a while. And so she did, and then they were married a couple of years later. But she was just a lovely person.
This is Willeen now.
Willeen Harder.
Willeen Harder, right.
And she took my place, so I stopped teaching.
Now, you said that Mr. Patterson was the assistant principal. Who would have been the principal at that time?
I think Mr. Work.
Mr. Work was the principal,
believe.
O.J. Work.
He was the principal, and Mr. Close was the superintendent.
Frank Close was the superintendent.
Yeah, Frank Close.
One of the things we would want to do is to make sure that we get all of these names in here, because that's one of the goals of this series of programs for the Wadsworth Area Historical Society.
Yes.
And that is to get oral history so that one of these days somebody might want to record it, and that person then would have all these data to record. Where was the high school at that time?
The high school at that time was, let me see, right downtown.
Where the Central Middle School is now.
Right.
Right. And do you remember what room you were in when you taught?
Well, let me see. It's rather hard for me to remember. but I think I was downstairs.
Downstairs?
Yes, in one of the rooms downstairs.
Now, your husband Willard was teaching there also, was he not?
Yes. He was teaching at that time world history.
World history?
Yes, and according to state, everyone at that time had to take world history.
Yes.
So he had a good many students, you know, that he remembered. He loved to teach.
Well, all of us had him. All my brothers,
did
my
you?
3 brothers and I had him.
Oh.
For one thing or another over the years. Go ahead.
He enjoyed it very, very much. And then later on, I think it was about in the early 40s, that rule was changed so that he had less of the students. World history at that time wasn't required for everyone. And so there were a good many students that preferred not to take world history.
Now, were you living where you live right now?
No, we had rented a house that belonged to Mr. Blau on...
Which Mr. Blau? Tex Blau?
No, Tex Blau's father.
Tex Blau's father yet?
Yes.
Wow, that
It
goes
would have
way,
been.
way back.
It would have been, and it was on Prospect Street.
On Prospect.
Yes, the house is still there, and it was a very nice house. It was not far from Lincoln School.
Right.
And we were there for 2 years, and then we bought a small 3-bedroom house on Baird Avenue.
On Baird.
And that's where our 4 children were born.
Right.
I mean, that's where we lived.
Now, didn't she used to walk to school? Or Willard did?
I used to, well, when I started to teach well, it was in 53, I think, that I started to teach. I didn't expect to.
53?
53, I think, at Isham.
At Isham.
Mr. Isham called me and asked me if I could teach. I had substituted a little bit, and if I could teach out there regularly, because the person that was hired to teach wasn't very well, and she really didn't want to teach. So I decided, the children all said, well, they would help me, you know, and I could teach. So I did for 2.5 years. And then I thought, well, you know, I really think maybe I won't teach because I was so terribly busy. But I began to think that in college we would have 3 children in college for 2 years at a time.
Right.
And that I better teach.
You better teach.
So I called Mr. Isham and asked him if the place was still open. This was after I'd gotten a little rest.
Now, Isham, Mr. Vernon V. Isham, is that right? The school is named after him.
Yes.
Do you remember much about him? Could you tell us a little bit about Vernon V. Isham?
Well, he was a fine principal to work for. And I enjoyed working out there very much, but I think he and his wife, I think, had no children.
Well, they had an adopted child.
Did they have an adopted?
No, so they had a child, yes. She was not adopted. Then she died. She was retarded, and then she died at age 13 or 14.
Oh.
Miriam Isham was his wife, was it not?
Yes, yes.
Yeah, Miriam.
Yes.
I knew her
You
very
remember.
well, yes. I do remember those people. Could we go back to the high school just for a second, Orpha, to talk about some of the people who were in the high school at that time? Do you remember Mr. Close's secretary at that time, or Mr. Works' secretary?
I wonder if it was Mrs. Holcomb.
Mrs. Holcomb.
Mrs. Holcomb was the secretary there for a number of years.
Now, would that be Ray Holcomb's wife? Or one of the other Holcombs?
Ray Holcomb. Was Ray Holcomb the principal?
Yes, right.
No, it was his brother.
His brother's wife, right.
Yes, his brother's wife.
I wanted to clarify that. That is correct, and I wanted to clarify that if I could. What about some of the other teachers that you remember at the Wadsworth High School in the 30s when you went there?
Well, Mr. Wright was a coach.
Art Wright.
Art Wright was a coach.
Now, you remember that we have an Art Wright Stadium.
Yes.
Tell us a little bit about the colorful Mr. Wright, the colorful Art Wright.
Mr. Wright He was really very good-hearted man.
He surely
had a
was.
wonderful, big heart. But he also had a temper.
A temper?
As I remember. And he was quite opinionated, too.
Yes, I think he was.
Uh-huh. But he was a very good friend, and his wife I got to know very well, too, and enjoyed her.
He was a coach, as I
Yes,
remember, and he
he
taught
was a
history
coach.
as well.
Yes.
I had him for a history course way back in
Did
the
you?
40s, that's correct. And I remember that he was in the service,
Yes?
and he was coming home, I think probably, after being discharged from the service, and he couldn't get a train, and of course at that time airplanes were very few and far between.
Right.
And I remember the story that Art Wright actually got 4 or 5 other people. They hired a taxi, and they came all the way across the country in the taxi, and they split the cost of it, and they got home.
How interesting. I didn't know that.
Yes, I remember that because we were in school at the time.
Yes.
Do you remember any other teachers who would have been teaching
I
there?
remember Mr. and Mrs. Morningstar.
Lloyd Morningstar.
Mr. Morningstar was the teacher.
Lloyd.
Yeah.
And what did he teach? Didn't he teach
I think it was agriculture.
agriculture? That's
that
correct.
time.
Lloyd,
And-
and we don't have agriculture anymore now.
No, I know.
But at one time, Wadsworth was a very severe, well, I shouldn't say severe, it was a very powerful farming community.
Yes.
And agriculture was extremely
Yes.
important. Yeah.
It worries me a little bit now when I drive on the outskirts of Wadsworth to find so many housing developments and the lack of farmland.
Yes, that's true.
Because I think, I remember reading a book about China when Mao wanted everyone to go into the factories, you know, to produce things. And eventually China became, there was a terrible famine and starving.
Yes.
Because so many people had left the farms. And I think about that when I think of the lack of farmland.
Yes,
you know?
I do too, and it bothers me. As a matter of fact, I've been working on a committee recently trying to preserve farmland here in
Good.
Medina County, just for that reason.
Good.
Orpha, as you came downtown as a young married woman, where did you go to the grocery store to shop, for instance?
Well, there were 3 grocery stores.
3 grocery stores
Yes,
in Wadsworth.
Right, there was one near the corner on High Street, High and Broad. You know,
High and Broad?
yeah.
Or high and, was it High and,
I can't think of the man's name.
it was Big Connect, wasn't it? Mr. Connect?
Well,
Was that the Big W Market?
there was one, yes. This was a smaller store, I think,
I see.
as I remember, in that first block, and it was a very good store. And then there was
Wasn't there Mr. Mosier who was up there too?
Mosier.
I thought Mr. Mosier had a store up in there.
I believe he did.
Yes.
I think it,
What were the other 2 other stores then?
well, one was the IGA.
The IGA, was
which-
it Overholt and Freeborn at that time, was it not?
Yes, that's right.
And then it changed to Abrams and Mansfield, as I
Yes.
remember.
You're right.
Yes.
Uh-huh.
Now then, are any of the descendants of Overholt and Freeborn still living in Wadsworth?
Overholt.
As I remember, the Overholt girls, there were 3 girls. Were there 4? 4 girls. And I think Pat Hollow still lives in
I
Wadsworth.
was going to say, I think Pat is still here.
Pat Hollow still lives here.
Yeah, but
And
I think the others are out of town.
Out of town, right.
Yeah.
And what was the 3rd grocery store then?
And the third one, I think was the A&P.
The A&P.
And
but
it was on
College Street, right.
College Street. And
For a
Mr.
while.
Mr.
Mr. Nipper.
You remember
Yep,
Mr.
yep,
Nipper?
Yeah.
I think he was in charge, I believe.
Didn't we also have a small Kroger store for a while in Wadsworth?
Yes, we did.
Yes, where a saloon is now, they're on College Street,
Right.
on the south side of College Street.
Right.
Now, I suspect that you didn't go to hardware stores very often. But where did Willard go to a hardware store?
Oh. You know, it's hard.
As I remember, Hoagland's Hardware was...
Yeah, Hoagland's well, I believe Hoagland's Hardware was in about the same location. Well, it was on the corner of High Street, wasn't it?
Just
College and, High Street.
And do you remember Wright's Department Store?
Yes.
Tell us about Wright's Department Store. That was really something, was it not?
Yes, right.
Tell us about that.
Well, Wright's Department Store, you could find most everything there. And, of course, they had wonderful yard goods, as I remember.
Yard goods.
And, well, I used to go there quite often. I've sort of forgotten now.
Now then, as you remember something such as Wright's Department Store, were there any dress stores in Wadsworth or clothing stores for women?
Yes, there was a lovely dress store, dress shop. I think it was called Bees.
Bees Dress Shop.
Dress Shop.
And it was owned by
next to Brenny's.
Right next to Brenny's. And it was, I think it was owned by Lee Vinnick.
Right.
Yes,
I think that was the name.
Brenny's, you just mentioned Brenny's Department, or Brenny's Drugstore. Tell us about Brenny's Drugstore. Incidentally, Wright's Department Store was on the opposite corner from Brenny's.
Right.
And Brenny's was right there on the corner of Broad and High Street.
Right.
Tell us about going into Brenny's Department Store and what you would see.
Oh, Brenny's store, he had a soda fountain
Yes.
for one thing. And which was very popular.
Oh, it was, yes.
And it was a lovely store. Brenny himself was very affable and pleasant to work.
Oh, he surely was. And who else worked in there, the Brenneman family?
You know, I've forgotten who worked in there. I know a number of students worked in there.
Did you? Who were some of the students who worked in there?
Going to high school. One was a Tannehill girl.
Tannehill.
I think that worked, worked there.
Well, then Clara, his wife, worked there too. She was a pharmacist too, wasn't she?
I believe so.
Yes, Clara was a pharmacist.
Yes, that's right, she was. And I know my father-in-law used to go in there every day.
Every day. Now tell us about your father-in-law. Here was a colorful character.
My father-in-law really was a wonderful man.
Dick Hunsberger.
We moved from Baird Avenue down to High Street with my father-in-law, actually, after my mother-in-law had passed away in June.
And this is in High Street where you're presently living?
Where I presently live,
I see.
And we needed a bigger house, and we were looking around for a larger home. And then my mother-in-law passed away. Well, my father-in-law thought he would go down to the Park Hotel and just rent a room.
And we'll get to the Park Hotel in a second. I want you to tell me about that one, but go ahead and tell us about your father-in-law first.
But we persuaded him that if we came down, he could stay there and he could have the, what was the dining room before as his bedroom. He wouldn't have to go up and down the stairs. And he was 89, I think, when we went down in '53.
And how long did he live?
And he lived to be 104. Almost 104. It was minus 3 weeks of 104. And you know, the amazing thing was that he was able to take care of himself until he was about 102. And then he began to forget downtown how to get home. You know, so I had to keep the front door locked. I had a little hook that I put up above the front door, and do you know he never tried to open that hook?
He did not.
No. And that was the amazing thing. And I called him for supper. He was ambulatory, you know, which is amazing. At
for 104.
104. And I called him for supper one night, and he fell from his chair, rocking chair. And I don't know whether, the doctor didn't know whether his hip just gave way or whether he broke it in the fall, but he fell, and of course, then lived only from, they did operate, but he lived only until the following Sunday. But I think he might have had trouble learning to walk again, you know.
More than likely, at 104. I mean, that's pretty old. But he was in good shape. I remember him very well.
Do you remember?
Oh, I surely do. He would go down to Brenny's. He's a great man for talking politics.
Yeah. Oh, yes. And I remember one time, you know, he would go into one restaurant and another, and one thing that kept him living, I think, was the spirit of young people started making over him downtown. And one day he was at the restaurant on College Street, and there was a man he didn't know sitting next to him, standing at the bar, and he said to him, "Who are you going to vote for?" And this man turned to him and he said, "It's none of your damn business."
Oh, my.
And he wasn't used to being talked to like that.
No, I'm sure he told him in a hurry.
Oh, my. So, but he had a wonderful memory. And he could tell, he told of his first trip out to California, shortly after the trains had been completed. And he just had a wonderful memory.
How long has he been gone now?
He died in 68.
68, so
Yes.
it's almost 30 years.
Yes.
So he would be 133 years old now, 134 or so.
I guess he would be.
So he was born then.
He was born in, wait a minute, 1864.
1864.
Right.
Mhm.
And it seemed to me that his father was born in 1812 or something like that.
1812.
I believe so.
Now, was his father born in Wadsworth too?
No, his father was born in Berks County, Pennsylvania.
And then was
And he was the first minister of the Mennonite Church.
of the Mennonite Church.
And
Ephraim
right,
Hunsberger, yeah.
Ephraim Hunsberger.
Now, there are 3 Mennonite churches in Wadsworth.
Yes.
Which one was he was the one for the first Mennonite church, was he not?
Yes, First Mennonite Church.
Which was where at that time?
Well, it was it was on College Street, I think.
Which is presently
which is now the Episcopal
Church, the big white church, which is a historical church, incidentally.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And Ephraim Hunsberger was the first minister. Then Dick, your father-in-law, was born here in Wadsworth?
Yes.
I see. And then, of course, Willard was born in Wadsworth.
Yes.
And I know a story about Willard's birth. Of
Yes.
course, I wasn't there. But in the very early 40s, when I was in high school, mid-40s I guess it was, I met your good husband because he was a teacher, and we would go over to Smith's Dairy every day at lunchtime for a little something. I don't know why, of course we didn't need it, but we would go over there for a little something. And he and another teacher would go over there also, and they would have a Sunday.
Uh-huh.
And the 2 ladies who worked in there, one was Miss Yoder, and the other one was Miss Shue, S-H-U-E. Now, we never called them by the first names. In those days, you didn't call anybody by a first name if the person
yes.
were older. So I think Miss Yoder's first name was Hattie, I'm not positive, but we called her Miss Shue. And we were over there one time, and I guess I said something to him, and he said, "Well, are you related to the other Carino boys that I have had?" I said, "Yes, I am." "So will you give them my best?" So that evening I went home, and my oldest brother at that time had just got back from the war. My brother Chris had just got back from the war, and he was wounded. He was severely wounded. He's now dead, but he was very severely wounded, and he was living at our house, obviously. He had pretty well incapacitated. He had been wounded in Germany in the service. You remember, he was a violinist, and he could no longer play the violin because of that.
I remember that. Yeah. I thought that was so sad.
Well, it is, but you know, those things were dealt with.
Right.
So he said, "Well, you go back and ask Mr. Hunsberger, give him a date, and that fast you'll come up with whatever happened to that year." So the following day I went in there and I said, "Mr. Hunsberger, my brother said for me to ask you or to give you a date, and you can come up with whatever happened in that year." He said, "Fine, give me a date." I said, 1901. "Oh, that's simple. I was born."
Is that funny?
And he was born in 1901 then, wasn't he?
Yes. Uh-huh.
So he would be 96 years old if he were living. Is that right?
Yes. He was born on Valentine's Day.
On February 14th,
February
1901.
14th. Right.
And he's been gone for how long now?
For 4 years.
4 years. It just seems like yesterday we went to his funeral.
Yes.
Tell us about the Park Hotel. That was something, and no one knows about the Park Hotel anymore because it's no longer there. What's there right now, Orpha?
Well, a hardware store now is there, and the dime store, what we call the dime store, Ritzman.
Ritzman's Pharmacy and all that.
Ritzman's Pharmacy.
But it was the dime store, the 5 and 10 cent store.
Right.
And didn't that used to be down the street farther?
Well, I guess it did.
Yeah.
There,
when Elsass owned it. When Bill Elsass, or Ed Elsass owned it. If you remember, down there, it was halfway down the next block, wasn't it?
Yeah, I believe it was.
Yes, right.
You're right.
Right. And the Park Hotel, describe it, what it looked like.
Well, the Park Hotel was a very homey looking, large building with a big front porch.
Big front porch.
Big front porch. And I think they used to have, people would go in there, and traveling salesmen would stop there, and people would go in there and talk to them, and I think it was quite a social place. And I think Mrs. Fixler.
Yes,
yeah.
the Fixler family, right, owned it.
Fixler family owned it.
Do you remember what was right behind the Park Hotel? And kind of a greenish building, green tar paper or whatever?
I can't
Dr.
remember.
Levere's. Remember Dr. Levere's, who was a veterinarian?
Oh, I remember. Oh, yes.
Yes.
Oh, I remember. One time, we had a pet crow.
A pet crow.
A pet crow up on Baird Avenue. And one time, Debbie, that's oldest daughter, took the crow down to the veterinarian to ask him if he could fix an injured foot that it had. But he didn't, but he was very nice to Debbie when she brought the crow down.
He probably was more used to fixing horses' feet and things of this nature. Now, as we looked at the Park Hotel, there was an alley between the Park Hotel and what is now Bixler's. Do you remember what was in Bixler's before it became that?
Bixler's. I can't remember.
Bob Sandel's Sr. had a saloon there. Do you remember that?
Did he?
Bob's Cafe.
Oh.
Do you remember that? And then right next door was Hoagland's Hardware. And then right department store.
Oh.
Tell us about the first cars that you remember as you were growing up.
Well, I lived in Cleveland,
You lived
as
in
I
Cleveland.
said.
Now, are you going to tell us how old you are, or are you going to let us guess?
Well, I'm 60. I'm 87.
87.
87.
God bless you. You're in wonderful shape.
Well, I really am very, very fortunate. My biggest trouble, I think, is my growing deafness, and then I have some trouble with my knees. But I'm very, very lucky. Otherwise,
Well, I'm 20 years younger than you are, and I have growing deafness and trouble with my knees as well, so it probably has nothing to do with that. You're in wonderful shape.
Thank you. But I was one of 7 children, and we used to, when we would hear a car come by, and this seems almost impossible now, but we would run to the front window to see it. To go by, and of course, such a thing as an airplane.
Oh no, it didn't.
Was almost unknown. And I can remember as a teenager, one time in church, hearing the minister mention that if there were another war, we probably would do a great deal of fighting with airplanes.
With airplanes.
Yes, and it was hard for me to imagine that could be, and of course, that happened.
Yes, it did. It happened in World War I, and of course it happened even much more so in World War II.
Yes.
What do you remember about the cars that was so significant?
They were not as smooth. They weren't near as rotund or smooth as they are nowadays. They
Kind of
were,
boxy.
yeah, boxy looking. And I can remember we had a Ford, a small Ford. I
Model
guess you
T,
call it a-
probably? Model T?
Yeah, Model T, which you managed with 3 pedals.
3 pedals,
Uh-huh.
right?
And we
No
had
gear
that-
shift, no gear shift.
No gear
No.
shift. And we had one of those, finally, you know, it was a while before we had one, but we were so proud of that car. And one night, my father thought he heard some shuffling outside along the driveway, and I think the car was parked in the driveway. And he got up finally and looked out the window, and the car wasn't there.
Uh-oh.
It had been stolen. And
No.
it was found by the police on the west side of Cleveland a couple weeks later. But we were glad to get it back.
Oh, I would imagine
I
so.
think-
I suspect that they didn't even have an insurance for
No.
cars in those days,
Oh,
did they?
no, we didn't.
And of course, no driver's license, did they? You didn't have to have a driver's license to drive until, I think,
No,
1937.
I don't think we did. I think we were supposed to be a certain age.
Now,
So-
do you remember learning how to drive?
Yes.
And what did you learn how to drive on?
Well, I learned how to drive on this Model T.
The Model T with the 3 pedals.
My brother-
Tell us how that worked, how you worked those 3 pedals.
Well, I don't know as I can remember, but I think the one on the right was the low, and then the one on the left I think was the brake, and I think the one in the middle was the reverse, but I may be wrong about that. But I learned to drive. Well, we lived in Burton in the summertime, and I think my brother taught me to drive, but I wasn't of legal age, you know.
How old do you think you might have been at that time?
I think I was about 14.
So 14, and you were
And-
born in 1909.
I was born in 1910.
Oh, 1910.
Yeah.
So in 1924, you learned how to drive. Do you know what kind of car it was that you learned how to drive on?
It was a Ford Model T.
A Ford Model T. Oh, you
And-
just said that. That's right.
And then in 1936, I was teaching in Connecticut. I had graduated from college in 30, and
Where did you graduate from?
I graduated from Middlebury College,
Middlebury College.
which is noted now for its languages. you
That's
know,
right,
different
yes.
languages. And at that time, they were noted mostly for their French department.
French
They teach all languages now. But
Middlebury College, I believe, is now used by the United States government to teach people languages before they go abroad. for
Oh,
the-
it might
Yeah,
be, you know. And anyway, I got a job in Connecticut, and then in 36, I transferred from Connecticut to Cleveland, got a job there, and then I was married the next year.
In 37?
36.
Oh, in 36? So you've been married for about 60
long
years,
time.
61 years, right. As you would go down, quote, into the South End, describe the South End in the early 30s when you were here.
Well, it was an active place.
Very active, wasn't it?
The match company was going full steam, and I think, well, I know it was working 24 hours. I think they worked night as well as
Yes, they
morning.
did.
Yeah, producing matches. And the injector company was
Yeah.
in full swing, and it was just a busy place.
Yeah. Was the salt still there, the Ohio salt, or had that been moved already when you were growing?
I think wait a minute. I think the salt had moved.
Had been
I-
moved
I
already
believe-
to,
I think so.
yeah, I think they had
so.
moved already to
I think
Rittman.
maybe their offices were still
Yes.
on the south.
Yes, they did.
Main
As a
Street.
matter of fact, they were there in the 40s. The offices were still there in the 40s, as I
yeah,
remember.
yeah,
Now, if we look at Wadsworth today, we see probably 70, 80, 90 factories, little ones. So, you know, manufacturing units. We used to call them factories, but now they
Yeah.
call them manufacturing
Right.
units. How many did we have in Wadsworth when you were growing up that you can remember?
Not nearly as many,
Oh, no.
no. The match was here, the injector was here.
And I think the
There-
Chemotex,
the
Chemotex
salt
was
was
just
here.
out there, in the southeastern part of Wadsworth, the rubber company, the Chemetex,
Yes.
was that out there
Yes.
too?
Well, I think so.
Yeah. Yeah, the Chemetex, I believe, was there, because I remember that when I was still growing up, and I'm a little bit younger, but I still remember that. What about things such as the police department and things? Do you remember the policeman when you were here?
Well, Harv Weldy,
Harv
I
Weldy.
think, was the head of the police. I'm not sure.
He was.
but
I don't think that he was ever.
Maybe he wasn't the
I
head.
think Tommy Lucas was the.
Oh, yes,
yeah,
I
Tommy Lucas.
remember the name
But
Lucas.
Harv Weldy was everywhere, and I think everyone in Wadsworth knew Harv Weldy.
Yes, yes.
Nice guy, one wonderful person.
Yeah, very
And,
nice.
Yeah, and strict and so forth. Was Ed Transu a policeman at that time too? Do you remember Ed
Transu? I think so.
Yeah.
I
He
think
was
so.
a tough man.
Yeah.
They tell the story about Ed Transu arresting 5 people on the Erie Railroad track way east of Wadsworth. Did you remember that story?
Oh, no.
And he went out on horseback. This would have been in the teens. He went out on horseback. I'm almost positive. I'll have to ask Carol, his daughter, if this is true. But I can remember it. And of course, the story has probably grown since it started some years ago. But even half of it would be encouraging to young people looking at police work as a career. He went out there all by himself, and he arrested 4 people. And he brought them back, he put them on the horse and had them walk, and he brought them all the way back all by himself.
Oh, my God.
He's a tough man. Ed Trance was a tough man.
Oh, he must have been.
Yeah. Now, do you remember much about Tommy Lucas?
No, I really don't. I never knew him well.
Well, he was, I think that he was a very colorful kind of a person, just a wonderful person. He never wore a uniform, rarely would he wear a uniform. He always wore his hat, his coat and so forth and so on. When we went to the grocery stores, right now, if you go to Bueller's or somewhere like that, you walk up and down the aisle with a basket or with a cart, and you fill it up, and then you take it home. Describe what the grocery stores were like when you were going in the 30s
Well,
or the 20s.
They didn't, first of all, they had very few frozen things that
No
you could
frozen
buy,
things, okay, that's
and
right.
You couldn't think of buying a frozen dinner or
Oh,
anything
no,
like
no.
that. The vegetables were all fresh, and they were, you could see them, and you could, it seemed to me that we didn't pick it out so
No,
much
someone
either
went and
as
got
we
it
do
for you.
now, I mean, we can go to Bueller's and pick out grapefruit ourselves and oranges and things like that, but it seemed to me that the person in charge did most
The
of
clerk
that.
did all that.
The clerk did most of that, and you usually just bought a sack of groceries that you could carry home,
Yes.
or
Or they would deliver it, perhaps.
yeah. Oh,
Now-
and they did deliver. I just thought of the one grocery store there near Brenny's was Mr. Lawrence.
Oh, yes,
Remember
Lorenz's
Mr.
grocery.
Lorenz's
Yes,
store?
I had forgotten about that.
And I think she used to work in there some of the time.
Yeah, she did. Lorenz's, I remember that now. Yes, I'm glad you remembered that name. I would imagine that anybody's born right now would probably think the scanners, that they just push something over there. How did they add up your bill?
Oh, they'd add it by hand.
By hand?
Yes. They had no, as I remember, they didn't have a cash register
No.
that they could figure this all out on.
Nothing at all.
No.
They would write it down.
Yeah, write it
And then they
down,
would
and
add
then-
it up, and then they would give you your bill and you would pay for it.
Right.
Do you remember how much a bag of groceries cost when you were buying in the 30s?
Well, it was quite different because.
Oh, you bet it was.
Oh, yes. I can't remember, but you could get an awful lot for $5.
Oh,
$5.
indeed.
And
Tell us about
That-
the price of meat at that time. For instance, ground meat. How many pounds could you buy for $1?
oh my, you could probably buy 5 pounds.
Yes.
5 pounds
And
for $1.
if you wanted to get the really, really good stuff, you would get 3 pounds for $1.
Yes, I
Yes.
think that's right.
3 pounds per dollar. That's just, those days are gone, of course, but you know, that was a tremendous price for anything.
That reminds me, when our twins were born, I hired a wonderful girl, a Mennonite girl who was home from a winter program in the East, and she happened to be, you know, out of a job, and Willard mentioned at school they were looking for somebody to come to help, and she came and stayed for 3 years.
Do you remember her name?
Yes, Mabel Geyser.
Mabel
Well, she's
Geyser.
Mabel Geyser now,
Yes,
but she was Mabel Rohr.
Mabel Rohr.
And I attribute my good health today for her being there, and she stayed for 1.5 years.
And we all know Mabel Geyser. She's a
Yep.
wonderful person.
Oh, she is. And
I love to hear her talk.
yes. Well, I was going to say, her fee was, this is almost impossible to think of, $6 a week. And she lived in.
$6 a week.
$6 a week.
Oh,
this
my
gives you
heavens.
an idea. This would be in 41, $6 a week. And we were paying her the going wage, you know. And she worked. She did so many things. I learned to make bread from her.
Is that right?
She made bread every week. And of course, at that time, there were no, well, there was diaper service that you could hire. You know, a truck would come around, but there weren't any
Disposables.
disposable
No, not
diapers.
at all.
And she was just a wonderful person. And then finally, after 1.5 years, and then automatic washing machines, you know.
Oh, there weren't
Hardly
any.
anybody had
No.
one. And then she decided that she was going with the boy that she later married, Mr. Ben Geyser, would bring her home many times on Sunday evening. She'd go home Saturday. Her father would pick her up. She'd go home and be there Sunday, and then she'd come back Sunday night. And she decided she would like to do something different, so she got a job down at the Match.
Uh-huh.
But I think of those wages then, and I think, you know, it sounds as if we weren't paying her anything. But
Well, you were paying her a good wage.
The going wage.
Have you tried to hire household help today, Orpha?
No, well, I still do my own work.
I'm sure you
try
do.
to do my own work, but sometimes I would like to hire help, but I imagine it's $10 an hour. I don't know what it is.
If you can get it for $10 an hour.
Is that
Oh,
right?
it's in much more than that, I believe.
Is that
we
so?
don't hire any help ourselves, but I know people who do, and they pay up to $15 to $20 an hour sometimes.
Is that so?
That's
I didn't realize it was that expensive.
it's very expensive.
Uh-huh.
It's, you know, really strange that you would have mentioned that Willard asked for a person at the high school and you got someone.
Yes.
Can you imagine today going to the high school and saying, I would like to have you come and stay with me night and day and do all of my work and just go home on the weekend? These kids would never be able to do that. But that was very common in those days, was it not?
Yes, yes. I think that's true, that nowadays you'd have difficulty. I mean, the children, for instance, they wouldn't know how, many of them, to work.
Right. You lived during the Second World War, of course. As a matter of fact, you lived during the First World War.
Yes, I did.
Could you tell us your, I guess for the want of a better name, your frightening experiences during the First World War as compared to the Second World War? What really frightened you in the First World War and as compared to the Second World War?
Well, of course, I was quite young during the war, from 14 to 18.
Right.
And I guess there weren't enough airplanes, so I was ever in fear of airplanes coming, you know, across the ocean.
But the Second World War...
But in the Second World War, I think there was always a fear, you know, that there might be nuclear
bombs and so forth coming
bombs
across.
and so on.
Do you remember rationing at all? Rationing food?
Pardon?
Rationing food?
Oh, yes.
Tell us about the rationing program.
Well, I was so lucky with the rationing program because our children were small, and I got a rationing card for each one.
Oh, I see.
And We had four, Debbie, and then not quite 2 years later, we had the twins.
Twins.
That's why I was so busy. And then 5 years later, we had Frank. And so I had 4 rationing cards. And the only time where when I felt a little pressure was when the children had their birthdays, because they all came between, let's see, February 19th and March 15th.
Wow.
And I always made each child a birthday cake, you know, and with the twins, each one had a different type that they liked. So I got sugar, plenty of sugar. And so I had no problem with the rationing, although I think my greatest problem was getting coffee.
Coffee.
Yeah.
And what about shoes for the kids? Wasn't that pretty difficult?
Well,
They were rationed too, weren't they?
I can't remember that I had any problem with the shoes. I can remember when we used to go into the shoe store and have the foot put under an X-ray.
Oh,
you know,
yes,
do you remember
right.
that?
They surely do.
And of course, they considered that not healthy later.
No, absolutely.
And they were taken out, X-ray.
Do you remember rationing gasoline in World War II?
Wait a minute. Yes, I do, because...
They had an A card, a B card, and a C card.
I guess so. I've forgotten, of course, we just had the one for home driving, so we didn't have
And
that.
more than likely, you had a B card because it was not, since both of you were in teaching, you were not in a defense organization.
No.
Only the A cards went to those people who had for defense.
Working in the factories, I
In the
suppose.
factories and defense and things of that nature.
We took Willard and I took a wonderful trip during that rationing period out to see the national parks.
Oh, really?
We went on a bus because...
On a bus, of course.
Well, the gas was rationing, so we couldn't drive, of course. So. But that was a wonderful trip. We saw a lot of what was national parks in the West.
Right. As you presently look at the clothing styles
Yes.
that people wear, let's take girls. What would people of your vintage say about what's being worn today? And tell us how you had the dress when you were in high school.
Well, in high school, we never heard of slacks.
Never
heard of slacks. And I can remember when I was teaching down at middle school, that there was a rule against wearing slacks.
For girls.
For girls. They weren't allowed to wear slacks.
No, I think it's just been recently.
And one day, one of the girls came in sort of jeans, and I said to her, you know, you aren't supposed to be wearing jeans to school because it was against the rules. But you know, within a couple of years after that, Glenna Durr.
I remember her,
Glenna
yes.
Durr?
I surely do.
Glenna Durr started to wear slacks. I mean, the rules were relaxed. She started to wear slacks. Everybody started to wear slacks because they're so comfortable.
Right.
And I think they're wonderful.
In so many
And
ways they
I
are.
think that was something that came from the Orient. I think from Asia.
Well, India.
India, Indonesia. They wore slacks. Their style was sort of a jacket and
the slacks.
pants.
What about the styles of young girls when you were in high school and elementary school? What did you wear?
Well, I wore, of course, skirts all the time, and they weren't short. They weren't terribly short.
No. And what about hose?
Of course, stockings. Always stockings.
You always wore stockings?
Yeah.
But none of the pantyhose or things like that they have today.
No.
They're just stockings.
Yeah.
And what about socks? Didn't a lot of the girls wear socks at those times, during those times?
You know, it's sort of hard for me to remember. I imagine they were beginning to wear socks.
Socks at that time.
Socks,
See, we look at socks today as thinking that's a young kid's apparel. But do you remember when socks actually came in? No one would wear socks in the teens, would he? Would he?
No,
or she?
oh no, I don't think so.
When did the socks start coming in?
Well, probably not till World War II, probably.
World War II.
Uh-huh.
Before that, people wore stockings.
Yes.
And do you know what kind of material the stockings were made of?
Yes, they were made of, well, lots of times lisle fabric, so that they weren't very, very thin. And I can remember when I got my first silk stockings. Oh, I thought they were just wonderful, you know.
Just wonderful.
Oh.
Tell us about the lisle stockings that the kids would not even have any idea today what they are.
Well, the lisle stocking was made out of probably a fine cotton thread. And they were, one would think nowadays they were heavy because you couldn't see through them hardly. And, but they were very comfortable.
And they were warm, weren't they?
And they were warm, yes. And they were, most everybody wore that type of stocking.
Now, hopefully not to embarrass you, but how did women and girls in high school hold their stockings up?
Well, I think there was a period of time where they rolled them.
Rolled them, right.
They rolled them at the top and twisted them around,
right.
you know, and then they would be tight.
And why did they have to stop that?
Well, I really don't know.
I understand that it was cutting off circulation and causing a lot of problems.
Well, it could have been.
So then what did they do to hold them up?
Oh, then they would get a garter belt or something.
Garter belt,
you know.
which was another apparel that they had to wear.
Yeah, so a nuisance.
A real nuisance. I never wore them, of course, but nonetheless, I understand that they were a real nuisance.
At least they didn't have to wear a tight corset.
No.
No.
They didn't have to wear tight corsets. Now, do you remember corsets in the days when you were growing up? And why did I understand? I know why we wore the women wore corsets, but they went out of style completely. But they were very, very.
Well, they were terribly tight.
Terribly tight.
In the middle, as I remember. I mean, I understand. I never wore one myself. But I remember my father-in-law's store. He had a general store right downtown.
What was the name of it?
Well, I think maybe it was Hunsberger's Dry Goods, but he also, Curtis. It might have been
Dick
Curtis and Hunsberger.
Curtis and Hunsberger.
Yeah, I think it was.
And where was that located?
That was located in the middle block on South Main Street.
Right, close to the bank, was it not?
Yeah, yeah.
Right next to the bank, as I remember.
Well, I think
a couple
maybe,
stores down?
I think maybe it were a couple of stores down.
Okay.
Not as far down as the country store now, but
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah, I remember the Curtis store there. And who was the tailor in the Curtis store?
Oh, who was it?
Weinsheimer?
Weinsheimer, right, Mr. Weinsheimer.
He was a bald-headed little man, but he's a tremendously good tailor, as I remember.
Oh, yes, he was.
Now then, Dick Curtis,
Yes,
then left that store and went over to the east side of the square and had an appliance store, as I remember. Curtis Electric, you remember that?
oh, there was, yes.
And
But was that the same Curtis? That wasn't.
well, it's a relative.
Oh, yes.
A relative of the
yes,
same
it
Curtis,
was.
but they had one there. But the Curtis and Hunsberger dry goods store then
Right.
closed down
Yeah.
in the 40s, did it not?
Yes.
Somewhere around there. The reason that I remember that so well is that that's where I saw my first television.
Did you?
I did. Now, do you remember your first television and what you remember seeing about it and where
yes.
it was?
You know, for so long we didn't have a television.
And very few people did.
Yes, and the first television that I think I ever saw was at Mr. Wright's house.
At Art Wright's house?
Art
And
Wright's house.
Do you remember where he lived at that time?
Yes, he lived on,
Crestwood?
no, not
No.
Crestwood. It was before they went up to Crestwood. They lived
Oh.
in a big house on Stevenson.
Oh, Stevenson's Court?
No, it was the next street beyond Stevenson. What is that? The
North or south?
south.
South, that would be, what, Baldwin?
Baldwin. I think it was Baldwin.
Mm-hmm.
Yes, it was Baldwin, about Baldwin and Pardee.
Baldwin and oh, way over there.
Yeah, on the
Baldwin
corner.
Pardee.
It was a white house, which had 2 or 3 apartments in it, I think.
Mm-hmm.
And I remember Liz had this television, and we belonged to this bridge club. And instead of playing bridge that night, we watched television.
We watched television. Do you remember what you watched and how it looked and how big it was?
Well, I can't remember exactly. I think it was a pugilistic,
They had, yes,
athletic thing. That
they had wrestling all of the time.
Yeah, it was wrestling. That sort of thing that we watched.
And you watched it.
Well, I watched it. We watched it for a while instead of playing bridge. I can remember I thought it was uninteresting because I don't know much about it, you know. So, but that's where I first, I think, when I first saw television. And
What year would that have been?
pardon?
What year would that have been?
Well, it doesn't seem possible. I think it was in the early 40s.
Probably mid-40s, you think?
Yeah, I think maybe 44.
I don't think they were out in 44 yet.
Maybe they weren't.
The first ones that came to Wadsworth were 1947.
Were they? Well, it was late then.
And people would go to store windows and look into the store windows because they would have them on, you know.
Yes.
Because very few homes had them.
Yeah.
And they're very small.
Yes.
Remember, they're small.
Yes.
And some people who were wealthy enough would get a great big magnifying glass that you would put over that, and you could see them a little bit better.
Yes.
I wonder what they would say now if they saw that the television sometimes cover the entire wall. Now, that sounds very funny to kids this day, but can you remember hearing the first radio?
Yes.
And when was that?
We had, well, I had come home from college, and my parents had gotten a small Emerson television, radio.
Radio.
About this big. I can still remember it. And to be able to hear sounds over the air, I thought was simply wonderful.
You couldn't believe it, could you?
No.
Now, was it a regular radio, or was it one of the crystal radios?
Well, I think my brothers had made a crystal radio first, because I had seen those. But the one that I remember distinctly, I think my brothers had made just a small one. But, you know, to be able to hear sounds was wonderful.
Was the voice clear?
Not too clear on the crystal.
And what about on the Emerson?
But on the Emerson, it was pretty clear.
Fairly clear. And do you remember what station that you listened to at that time?
Well,
In 1922 or 23?
it was, well, it would have been, I can't remember, but it was a station in Cleveland, I think.
Could it be WTAM?
Yes, I think it was.
WTAM 1100.
I think that was WTAM.
Yeah.
How wonderful that you remember.
Well, these things I can remember. Now, if you would ask me to remember somebody's name 2 seconds from now, I may not be able to do, but I remember those kinds of things. Now, the radio that you listened to, do you remember what the first radio program that you heard was?
Well,
You remember it was in television, it was wrestling.
yes.
Now, what was the first thing that you heard on
Well,
radio?
I think what we listened to, because my father enjoyed it so much, was Amos and Andy.
Amos and Andy.
Amos
Right.
and Andy, we hated to miss.
And at what time was that on? Do you remember?
In the early evening.
7 o'clock, I believe,
Yeah,
for
early
15
evening.
minutes, almost every.
Yep.
Who were some of the people on Amos and Andy that you remember? Besides
Well-
Amos and Andy and Kingfish and, what was his wife's name? I've forgotten that. Oh,
I've forgotten.
yeah, but it was a
That's
funny,
Uh-huh.
it was a completely funny. Now we've gone from radio to television, we've had cars, we've had stores, we've had clothing, we've had all, we could talk forever and ever about these kinds of things, but as you well know, we're somewhat restricted, but we might have you back sometimes if you'd like to talk about some other things. Let me ask you just one last question, if I may, please, Orpha. Of all of the things that have made a tremendous impression on you over these past 87 years, what is the most significant?
Well, that's sort of a difficult question. I think the changes in technology.
In technology.
And I think they've just been tremendous during my lifetime, and they were even more so in my father-in-law's years.
Oh, indeed they were.
But I think nowadays the technology they have in computers and the internet and things I don't understand,
Well, I don't
because I
either.
don't have a computer. I would have to take a course from scratch, and if I had one. But to be able to say, well, I'm going to study this on the computer,
It'd be difficult.
let's imagine.
It is outstanding, all of these things. And it has been outstanding that we have been able to have Orpha Hunsberger with us today, 87 years old, who has given us Wadsworth Area Historical Society's History on Film. Thank you, Orpha, and we'll be back with more History on Film.
You're welcome.